sponsor, West Monroe Partners. Next slide. Next slide, please. And I also would like to say thank you to you, our amazing families, volunteers, staff, board of directors, advisory council members, and community partners for your tremendous and unwavering support in 2020. Next slide, please. So this morning, I would like to take a few moments to provide a quick look back at 2020 and look ahead and continued work at 2021. Next slide, please. So back in March of 2020, Boyer was the first Bertha III provider agency to shift to all virtual visits for services. And what this meant to families, it ensured that our high quality services continued without interruption. Next slide, please. And during the spring of 2020, Boyer, along with every other Bertha III provider in King County, experienced a decrease in client enrollment due to the pandemic. However, Boyer, through our outreach efforts and incredible staff commitment, was able to curb this decrease. And by September 2020, Boyer experienced the highest number of families on record. In addition, given the economic impacts and challenges presented by COVID, Boyer stepped up our programming and family support efforts in 2020. Specifically, we expanded critical programs, including Boyer Connect for families facing homelessness, Cherish for children in the foster care system, and our Bridge program for children up to the age of 4. During 2020, our Bridge program quadrupled in the number of participants. And finally, our amazing program team partnered with a number of community nonprofits to provide and deliver basic need items such as diapers, clothing, and food to our families in need. Next slide, please. And I would also like to take a moment to express my sincere and heartfelt gratitude to the entire Boyer staff for their collective effort and innovation to pivot practically overnight in March of 2020 to adopt this new and challenging virtual model. Specifically, I'd like to thank our senior leadership team for their care and support of their staff. The pandemic, for all of us, created a number of challenges which we were able to work through and continue to provide the highest quality of services for our families. And I would also like to thank the members of our incredible equity change team for their continued commitment and work on our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and plan. Next slide, please. And with the onset of the pandemic again in early 2020, one of our primary goals was to maintain all staff positions. And I'm pleased to report that we were successful in doing so. This would not have been possible without the careful planning and guidance from our board of directors and senior leadership team. And we are also grateful to our incredible and wonderful donors, foundations, and corporate partners for their unwavering support in 2020. Your support enabled Boyer to achieve another strong year in terms of fundraising. In Boyer, we were also committed to ensuring that there were no barriers to access our services. Working with our government partners, we were able to provide tablets and data plans to our families at no cost to ensure that they could successfully participate in our new virtual model. And in addition, we continued our commitment to uncompensated care so that no family would be turned away due to financial circumstances. Next slide, please. So 2021, as we look ahead, we can continue as an agency to focus on 5 key areas. Number 1, our goal of increasing outreach and engagement efforts is to address any possible gaps in our services. Number 2, in terms of Boyer family experience, we will continue to enhance and improve our wraparound support services. And 3, improving language access continues to be a key priority for the agency to remove any barriers to service and/or programming. And 4, in terms of our staff and board development, we will continue our DEI work to diversify our staff and board in order to mirror the communities we serve. And finally, we will continue our advocacy efforts in order to ensure that all children with special needs and their families have equitable and inclusive access to our important services. Next slide, please. And a quick update on our operations and programs. Just a few days ago, on May 3rd, Boyer began to offer limited in-person services to families who cannot otherwise successfully access telehealth or virtual services. For example, children with urgent feeding concerns or complex vision concerns. Our team has worked tirelessly to ensure the safety and health of our families and staff, and this includes investment to enhance our HVAC system as well as provide PPE for all staff and implement new and special cleaning protocols. Next slide, please. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker and Boyer alumni parent, Dr. Caspi. Dr. Caspi is the founder and director of the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology at the University of Washington, whose mission is to develop, translate, and deploy open source, universally accessible technologies with a focus on benefiting individuals with motor limitations or speech impairment. She was named Changemaker by President Obama in 2016 and received the Northwest Access Fund Technology Innovation Award in 2017. As a Boyer alumni parent, Dr. Caspi is committed to transforming and streamlining access to assistive technology and helping people with diverse abilities meaningfully engage and navigate in the world around them. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Caspi.
Hello. Thank you so much for that introduction, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to share my slides. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike and Boyer, for inviting me to participate in this event. It's really a wonderful opportunity for me to come back to Boyer and be able to contribute however I can to this amazing institution that really helped us out in the beginning of our road in Seattle. As he mentioned, my name is Anat Caspi. I'm the director of the Taskar Center for Accessible Technology. We are part of the Paul G. Allen School for Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. And Mike already discussed our mission, so I can skip to the next part. But today, in particular, I wanted to note that in our focus on people with mobility limitations, I believe many of our lessons can translate really well to addressing the needs of communities in general. And the story I would like to promote today is to tell you how I went from essentially troubleshooting a problem that I faced as a parent new to Seattle with a kiddo who uses a wheelchair to leading an $11 million federal effort to use co-design approaches to collaboratively generate open data for sustainable, resilient, accessible communities. And so we are right now in a very timely point to discuss these kinds of concerns, because as streets are reopening, this is a very important moment. We have this amazing opportunity to kind of reset and reimagine our streets and cities and services. And we kind of have the responsibility to take a big picture, holistic approach, meaning with this hard of a reset, everybody being sort of out of circulation for more than a year, our development should really consider all social groups and take into real incisive look at the issues like equity and accessibility. And the story arc that I'm about to tell you today about the Open Sidewalks project and how it came to be a federal project is really a story arc on the realization that resilient, sustainable, and inclusive cities are what we want to reset to. And in order to have such resiliency, we have to be able to manage our communities in a standardized and metricized manner. So that's me taking my data science hat combined with my parent hat and trying to understand how we can change some of our design processes and city and transportation planning processes in order to eschew much more equity and inclusivity in our cities. But the progression that really led to our projects on smart cities really started from an understanding of how we really must ditch the current design norms. And this goes much further than just cities. It's really about design norms. So my outline today, we will talk about why we ought to ditch design norms. And this goes to pretty much any product out there, and discuss how mobility is really not transport. It's a very personalized matter. And so when we start talking about smart artifacts and smart cities, these are all about making personal decisions about how we use the artifacts in our lives or how we use the environment. And so the old imagining of a city needs to sort of be evacuated in order to conform to a new and different social norm that really promotes accessibility and inclusivity and a city for all. And so what the story arc is that doing smart city right necessarily is inclusive and accessible. So I'm taking a step back, and in all my interactions with students, I really try to emphasize that all engineers are designers. And therefore, we have a very important and grave responsibility to consider what exclusions we are inadvertently embedding in designs. And I have to acknowledge that all parents are also designers, but especially parents with kids with one-of-kind needs, because we have to troubleshoot on the spot and kind of, they call it MacGyvering things. I'm sure each of you are familiar with the needs that arise on an everyday basis. And the same kind of thinking needs to be embedded in all of our design and engineer students. And specifically, when I teach courses, I talk about design thinking, and designers. And importantly, I want to emphasize that design isn't and shouldn't be done in a vacuum. It's really a product of the designer and hinges on all the designers involving a nuanced understanding of all the people and stakeholders that are involved. But what ends up happening is that creates a pretty messy picture. And so design students try to move away from a picture like what I'm showing here, which is a pretty involved and integrated set of ideas around how to do design, but it's not a linear process. It's supposed to be an iterative process, but really it involves so many different types of skills, a lot of which designers don't necessarily have at the get-go. So when we try to converse on design, we want to have a really furtive conversation. It's not a one-time event. I really try to force teams to situate everyone in the conversation and explicitly explore what biases they bring to the table. And I ask team members, and especially designers, to challenge the assumptions about people and the environments for whom design is meeting needs. And so when I involve parents, or when I involve community members or therapists in the co-design process, we are trying to provide different ways to get around the biases by bringing these people in, bringing all the people in for whom design is intended to participate. And this necessarily means that when we create accessible technologies, we don't only take into account the primary user. It means that we have to acknowledge that we have this constellation or network of supports that the people for whom the technology is intended will also participate in the design. So one example that I like to bring up is kind of the evolution of alternative communication devices, where so many of the editing processes are very involved and not really designed with the therapist or parent in mind when we're starting to look at, what is the process by which we customize this device to a particular speech student or learner. So the objective of co-design is not only to widen the range of people that we consider when we design, but also to widen the applicability of the design by taking into consideration more perspectives than just our own. And in the context of our lives as parents, co-design really requires us to simultaneously acknowledge and also move ourselves away, kind of defamiliarize ourselves from our own experience, and then reformulate some of our ideas about the needs, either our own needs or the needs of our children, in order to address the fact that no two humans are the same. And there are really very specific needs that each stakeholder brings to the table. The hard part is really to be able to verbalize that. And I think these are some of the tools that we design as part of the Tasker Center for Accessible Technology in terms of how to glean that kind of information from our co-design participants. So that's still all really nice in theory. And I haven't looked at the chat yet to see if there are any kind of questions like, huh? But how do we actually in practice even identify who is the user that we want to focus on? And how do we teach our students to do this kind of unbiasing in practice? So although most companies and manufacturers devote major resources to researching the user population that their products will involve, many products still appear on the market that seem to not have been designed with the full spectrum of their users in mind. And I'm sure you have experienced or noticed some dangerous or baffling or irritating product design failures yourselves. And certainly if you have engaged with students or learners that have specific needs, that is a commonplace issue that we deal with on an everyday basis. So to give a real sense of this, this is John Porter's wall of exclusion. So John Porter is a good friend of mine. He is a former PhD student at the University of Washington and is currently a designer at Microsoft. And John has a disability and uses a wheelchair. And this is his pegboard, which displays an assortment of video controllers that require the use of not just one, but two hands. And John really has mainly use of one hand. And what we're seeing here is this mismatch between what expectations are baked into the designs versus what people are able to or wish to physically do. And so the primary reason is for us in co-designing to develop an understanding that unless we explicitly work with different methods that are oriented around looking at the variability among people, then otherwise it's useless to hope that the technologies that our design methods will yield will just organically be accessible or universally applicable. So we really need to focus on this, and focusing on this kind of inclusive co-design effort in some ways requires ditching the old way of doing things. But I wanna sort of note how we came about to really considering the average user. And in the story arc that I'm drawing here with respect to open sidewalks and looking at cities, you know, part of what we've done initially is trying to sell our ideas to entities like Google, right? Because Google functions or currently creates the most used directions and routing product out there. So everybody who is trying to route themselves in a city will log into maps.google.com and then attempt to identify directions in that web application or mobile app. And what's important is to say that when we were talking to them, they were like, well, you know, this is outside the experience of our average user. It's even outside the experience of, you know, 2 standard deviations from our average user. And therefore, we're not going to promote those concerns. And so I wanted to trace back a little bit of history of how we came around to really foregrounding this average user, or why is it important, in order to say that really it's an artifact of history and it's really time to challenge that idea. So recalling this idea of the average man, and in fact, it was called the average man, I'm going to give a super brief history of 19th century. And so a couple of astronomers get around together and they're measuring the speed and distance of the same celestial objects. And a lot of times they got several totally different measurements. And in order to know which ones to use in their calculations, the idea of using the averages method was created, and it was quickly really accepted. This average, it gave much better precision for any quantity. It allowed for standardization across different astronomers that were making these estimates, and it gave us much more confidence about these set of observations. And so, of course, this gave rise to the study of statistics and statistical analysis. And so far, so good. And in fact, most of machine learning today is based on this very idea. And so at some point, late in the 19th and early 20th century, we see this merging of statistical analysis and evolutionary social Darwinist theories of Galton. And so what happens is that rather than looking at these celestial bodies, people start measuring other people and quantifying them. And then average becomes this idea of an average man. But then if we're defining who is average, we find the need to define what is outside of the average. So we became motivated to define those boundaries that are outside of the norm. And first, I should say that this is a very instinctively human thing to do. We all compare ourselves to others around us. We compare our kids to other kids around us. And it's not all bad because, for example, that's the way we learn what's socially acceptable, by example. And many studies have shown that we take a very kind of statistical or stochastic approach to learning. The larger number of examples will modify our behavior. So if we see multiple examples of one thing, we will adopt that kind of behavior. But we also take note of outliers. And likewise, we've been teaching our machines to do the very same. So we teach through taking this very statistical averaging approach to modeling from many observations. However, while it's not necessarily the most natural progression, the context of the 19th century allowed for the migration of this statistics into the social realm. And that ended up defining actually a very ableist agenda that affects particularly people with disabilities, but actually affects all of us. Because somehow the normal individual became a socially constructed ideal, and then it became in direct opposition to anyone that was outside of that norm. So words in the literature start being used like feeble-minded, parasitic, morally questionable, deformed, amputated, obese, perverse, crippled, maimed, blinded. All of those are outside of these two red lines that are just two standard deviations of the norm. And this brings up a lot of questions, right? Whose norms are these? Are these norms overlooking some inequities in political, social, or economic situations? How do we know that what we measured or sampled is not actually biased? So like who we looked at, if we only looked at North American males, then obviously the average will be different. And I think it's important to understand that this kind of idea ends up, even today, implicating who is healthy versus impaired, who is sighted versus blind, who is socially typical versus socially atypical. And those informed classifications end up really impacting the way our institutions and product makers and manufacturers and designers respond to the needs of different people. And so we have to acknowledge that there was some socially beneficial reason to do this. For example, in the 19th century, when schools were like just a new innovative institution, it required the ability to separate individuals into different classes so that they'd be able to provide them some services that were appropriate for them. But then why do we really want to separate individuals in the sense of design and engineering products and apps and devices that brings a totally different question, because nowadays we're much better equipped to create technologies that are personalized and customized to the user without having to gloss over or look at just the average user as the main point of design. So even when user needs are being considered in design, it's still relatively easy for the designer to fall into the trap of designing for the average user. And on the face of it, like I said, it might seem like a good idea because you think you've covered the majority of the population, but actually experiments that get conducted, especially, so this is an example of an experiment in 1982 in the US, illustrates that in fact, when you start looking at multiple different categories, and in this particular instance, they looked at 11 different measurements, and looking at starting out with 4,000 individual males, as they tried to narrow in on multiple categories and people that actually fit the average man ideal for multiple categories, after just, I think, 7 categories, they remained with absolutely one person. And after 10 measurements, none were left. So in effect, by adopting this strategy, we're not actually covering anyone adequately. And that's one of the fallacies of design and why we ought to ditch this idea of norming the human and really looking at all the variability across stakeholders and being able to design for that. Okay, so I've talked a lot, and the question is, what does this have anything to do with the built environment and cities? And especially pedestrian ways can be really incredibly complex to navigate in urban environments. And each of us mobilizes differently. And I think the important part about the story that I have to tell is that there's this growing inequity, particularly having to do with routing and wayfinding applications, because recently we've all come to depend on our smartphones for navigating the city. But what many people don't realize is that these applications don't have a lot of different data and information that creates huge informational gaps for people who require more specific, more personalized kinds of data. So for instance, I kind of pick on Google, but it's really true of all the mass-produced digital maps. They are very car-centric and road data that is promoted there. And the walking trips or cycling trips or any kind of wheelable trips result in millions of people that don't have the information they need in order to get around. And so they face a lot more hardship and inequity when using these kinds of apps. So sidewalk navigation is essential to every kind of mode of transportation. And when we talk about mobility, we have to take sidewalk navigation into account because it connects all the different modes in the city, even connecting up to a private car trip. And sidewalks really make up the fabric of urban and community life, because every commuter, whether they're walking to their car or arriving home from a bus station, going for a jog or commuting to the next health appointment, everyone uses sidewalks to connect different modes of commuting. And as noted, the diverse preferences that we each present when we come to these environments creates these inequities in information and informational gaps for some travelers more than others. Due to the fact that we each mobilize differently, and mobility, unlike transport, is personal. It's a joint expression of the individual's needs and preferences and how they move in real time through physical space, a joining of that with the diverse environments that are presented. So the new US urban agenda really prioritizes sustainability. And as a result, cities are really looking to incentivize individuals to choose non-motorized mobility to perform their daily activities. And in many cases, we're thinking about penalizing people who use their vehicles via taxes and all these things. And we're told that smart choices are the non-motorized choices. But in light of these priorities, it's really crucial to understand how our local communities, how the infrastructure that we have access to does or does not provide the information and technology that supports a decision-making process that conforms to these ideals, right? I believe that current wayfinding trip technology doesn't actually give us the information we need in order to make these decisions that the city wants us to make that are sustainable, due to the fact that a lot of these trip planners don't actually tell me about routes that provide me with comfortable, accessible, connected trips. A lot of them make huge assumptions about what I can do in the environment, and particularly what I can do in the environment when I have my daughter and her wheelchair with us. And so ultimately, my belief, and this is what now sort of this federal grant is about, is that the feasibility of sustainable communities is all about engaging communities with a growing um, understanding of comfort and the ability to have the information you need and how much that dictates the choices that we make. So having comfort and having good information will enable us to make those sustainable decisions that the cities and governments want us to make. So in the US, many urban environments were planned with very different norms or social norms in mind. Of course, originally there was a lot of privileging of private vehicle use over public transport. And there are these iconic ideals of large suburban homes, two cars, access to and outbound systems of roads. And so in order to be able to ditch those ideas, we have to provide not just the infrastructure to support better trips, but also the technology and the data to be able to manage this infrastructure in ways that make it human-centric and not so car-centric. And so there are current smart city developments out there that really already rely on big data models. But the problem that I see with some of these approaches, like you may have heard of City Labs, which is an Google or Alphabet company. They won the Smart City Challenge from 2016 and received $50 million to create a smart city environment. And what Google offered them is a software tool and like the associated infrastructure in a product that's called Flow. And Flow really integrates big data with ubiquitous sensing. It harnesses the power of crowdsourced mobile data to really reduce congestion and trying to empower travelers with a presumed capacity to make these smart decisions. And what happens with a Google model on similar products, they erroneously still assume that a priori transit models can just be imposed on a built environment. So what they're saying is, okay, we will have our design and engineers create some model of like that ideal average man pedestrian, and we'll just let that homogeneous mobility model be able to kind of run our AI predictions about what choices people will make and what preferences they will make about their trips. And clearly, as I've spoken to, my own personal experience shows me very different divergence from this kind of way of designing for whether it be a big city or a data product or a manufacturing artifact. And so my vision as a data scientist, and as an end user of these and other products like trip planners, is that smart cities have to start with a community of practice and place. And we use technology to understand both computationally as well as culturally the links between mobility and how spaces are built and configured. So through our projects, we've talked to a lot of people. I hope that some of you would be interested in engaging with us in the future. And the idea is to take a very human-centric approach to mobility and city planning. And that includes talking to urban dwellers, especially commuters with diverse mobility needs, and learning their own travel patterns, giving them the information they need in order to make decisions that are smart, but smart for them. And so we really aim to make the use of pedestrian spaces easier and to maximize the traveler's ability to take delight in this non-motorized travel. So this particular quote that is shown on the slide is one that was provided to us by one of our participants. And Kevin, oops, sorry, tells us that using a tool like directions on Google doesn't really help him get around. Actually, sometimes it does more harm than good. I'm sent down streets I can't cross or up inclines that are impossible to climb. It can be deeply frustrating. And so going from this to actually designing an open data standard that will take in the kinds of objective data and information that Kevin would need, but also all our other stakeholders would need, and be able to produce a very customized, personalized experience of the city to every traveler. That is the goal of Open Sidewalks. And so for the past 4 years, we've really engaged in this kind of definition. So taking these comments from our co-designs, but also translating that into very coherent data schemas and information pieces that don't require people to comment subjectively, like, you know, you might have been participating previously in some of the crowdsourcing efforts that are currently out there on accessibility. They will ask people to just say, oh yeah, this path is accessible or not. But then the question becomes accessible for whom, right? As we have engaged with communities of people with disabilities, we know that accessibility is itself a very personal term. What's accessible to my daughter is certainly not what's accessible to other individuals. And we're looking for very subjective ways to answer all the questions that our different stakeholders have. Focus of our stakeholder experience is the individual commuter and asking, how do I find safe, accessible routes that are tailored to me? We do acknowledge that cities themselves have been totally unable to answer really crucial questions that come up that have to do with servicing the wide swath of individuals that live in the city. So for example, the paratransit operators need to know where do accessible paths exist and how can people access transit stops? And likewise, in city planning, we want to know how to prioritize infrastructure investments. And all of this is totally, it cannot be answered when we don't have that specific objective data about what's in the built environment and how can different people negotiate those environments based on their needs. So the upshot of all of this is that only through positive pedestrian experiences and a sense of place can we start to address the underlying obstacle to implement smart cities. And these complex processes of undoing the social norms, both in terms of undoing the norm of looking at just averages when we do design, but also undoing some of the norms of how we envisioned our lives idealized around urban spaces. We want to ask commuters to really radically change their mobility and consumption patterns, but the only way to do that is through creating these positive experiences and building sense of place. And that's why I believe the Open Sidewalks approach was selected for inclusion in this federal grant administration, as opposed to outsourcing this kind of effort to Google or other large, big data company. We do big data, but we also engage the local communities in order to better understand the specific needs of individuals on the ground and even specific communities. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor for questions if there are any. And I'm happy to engage anybody. I have some additional slides about our 5-year plan going forward, but I think it might not be so much of interest to this cohort unless you ask me specifically about that. So thank you very much for tuning in.
Dr. Caspi, we did have one question that came in earlier while you were presenting, and it said, any thoughts on if Biden's infrastructure plan addressing design and accessibility? And then it also said, how can Boyer support and advocate for your work?
Oh, that's great. So maybe I will go. So yes, we are part of the USDOT plan. And in fact, there are 7 additional projects that are specifically focused on access and inclusion, not just in urban spaces. So we are looking at rural environments as well. One of the major thrusts here is to be able to better connect rural environments with like healthcare, as well as other services that they might not have access to in their local rural environments. So to the question of how to support this, there are multiple ways. Our 5-year plan includes various ways that stakeholders can engage. So one is through an advisory committee. Another is through being a part of our testing cohort, because we will have 3 different mobility applications on the ground and need to have the input from different community members on how well it's working. And lastly, of course, there's the approach to funding, which is all about kind of engaging specific communities in the mapping of those environments. So we will be running a competitive process for different local organizations to kind of organize their communities around the data collection and talking to individuals on the ground. And that is something that if you have like a personal connection to a particular community and want to foreground their experience, we would be super happy to partner with you in terms of getting that, community organization up and running and supporting the project. So those are just some of the ways.
So this is a time we're opening up for question and answer. If you'd like to type your questions into the chat, I'll go ahead and read them for Dr. Caspi so she can respond.
Thank you. I can also, if we don't have questions, I can do a demo of Access Map, which is a little tricky because my student was going to do a release update just today. So we might be a little dodgy, but if you take that into account, I'm happy to try it out.
So we do have some questions coming in. Is the basic idea of open source contributions conceptually similar to the apps like Waze? Would contributors be both the general public and organizations serving unique populations?
I will say that our main effort is actually, so I'm by trade, data scientist and machine learning algorithms developer. So one of our main thrusts is not to have to rely on individuals for absolutely everything, because that becomes really onerous. But the ways part is really for all of the transient, just-in-time information. For example, this elevator is broken at the UW Stadium station. Those are the kinds of things that machine learning or AI wouldn't necessarily be able to contribute. So our approach, as I sort of was noting, we have both a big data kind of approach, which will, we have already partnered with Microsoft, and they're contributing all of their imagery data to us to be able to analyze that in a computational way to extract the information that we can from these static images. And then we will join that with these, yes, conceptually similar to Waze types of apps that allow people to comment on the specific attributes on the ground and how accessible this particular, infrastructure piece is at this time. And the idea is to enable this data to be used by any app developer. So by creating a data standard and what's called an API for people to be able to query this kind of information, that means that it's not just Google or Apple that can build the accessible trip planner, but in fact, somebody else who wants to create these open source or wants to create or innovate in the trip planning arena. And there are many people who are trying to do that. There's Movil and Move It and One Bus Away and Navilens and AbleLink. There are just a host of these independent app developers who might actually want to target a specific subpopulation that is not at all addressed by those large mass manufactured trip planners. And they too will be able to hook into this API and be able to get that kind of information.
So I think if no other questions are coming in, we would love to see your demo.
Okay, so like I said, this is a little dodgy because we're doing a new release just today, but let's try it. So a little bit, I should have timed it better, but so to access AccessMap, you just go into a web browser and type in accessmap.io. Currently, we are serving 3 different regions, but in fact, we have Bellingham, Renton, and Redmond coming up very soon. So what you'll see up front is that as soon as you open it, what is being highlighted is the pedestrian environment. We are kind of demoting roads, and what we're looking at are specifically the pedestrian ways. So you'll be able to say, oh yeah, this particular block has sidewalks on both sides. And Seattle downtown is not a great example because it really is pretty well outfitted with sidewalks on both sides. You see that there are some exceptions here as you get closer to the water. Another thing you'll see is that different sidewalks are colored in different color patterns. And I will just show the map legend, which says that the color is not really about the elevation. It's the elevation with respect to what the person indicated is their personal max. So remember, we're talking about this very personalized, customized experience. And so if I say, you know what, 8% is just a little bit lower than what I can take today. I'm feeling really good. I can jet up streets that are 10.5% grade. And so you see that the map changes in accordance to what I said was my max. So specifically, some sidewalks that were previously annotated as inaccessible, the dotted red line, now became accessible, but they're still in the low speed steep realm. So it's telling me, yes, it's getting closer to what I said was my max, but is below it. So I'm able to access that. Conversely, if I instead say, you know what, today I'm not feeling it, or I don't want to show up to my meeting all sweaty, I'm going to set my max at 6%, the environment itself changes as well. And you can see that some of the streets that may have been colored in red are now orange. And so I can inspect each different data point and see what kind of incline there is there. Oh yeah, 2.4, I can do this easily, or you can make that decision for yourself. Additionally, and this is much more for people who are concerned about shared spaces and crossings, we annotate all the crossings with whether they are marked, so those are the darker areas, and also whether there are curb ramps on both sides of the crossing to enable people to cross safely with wheeled devices. So what you'll see here is, for example, these two are annotated as not marked, but they are curb ramped. Sorry, I need to. So this particular empty looking thing is curb ramped, but is not marked. But then there are going to be some of these crossings that are going to be red lined and inaccessible to me, like this one. And that's because it is not curb ramped. And I said that I require avoiding barriers like raised curbs. So if I remove that, then the information becomes available that, yeah, this is actually an unmarked crossing. But it's no longer inaccessible to me because of the personalized indications that I made right here. One other thing to sort of foreground that experience of having really talked to our community of participants and understand how people are navigating on the ground. So we've tracked via GPS, as well as what people have told us via a lot of interviews. We're looking at how people make certain choices on the ground as they travel. And so, for instance, we talk to a lot of community members that have told us, you know, if I route from here just 3 blocks away, but I have a disability, or I just don't want to hike up these 11% grade streets, I really do use the indoor infrastructure when it's open and available. And so talking to our community really made it possible for us to even envision the mapping of these kinds of indoor infrastructure. And that too becomes part of the pathways on the map. And so obviously this is very different from the Google or Apple experience, because it will tell you, yes, it's open at this time of day. But if, let's say, instead of 11:51 p.m. a.m., I would be traversing at 8:51 p.m., then I can't use those indoor infrastructure based on the time, and therefore it's going to navigate me a ways away. So as you can see, this is not the 4-block Google shortest route path, but it is a path that I said was accessible to me based on these steepness considerations and the raised curbs. Now, if I reduce the constraints somewhat, I get a shorter trip, but it's going to be a little bit harder because I'm opening myself up to commuting over ways that have, much steeper elevation. You can also see how, so we get a lot of feedback from, moms with strollers, dads with strollers, caregivers, all kinds of participants that we didn't necessarily anticipate using this. Runners who actually do a selection for sort of the opposite. They want the high elevation changes, or bicyclists who don't want certain elevation changes on their path. I've used this during, snow days where I'm parking our wheelchair accessible van, and I do get a little bit scared parking that thing on really, really steep hills. And so this kind of information has been really useful for those other, repurposing of the tool in order to complete the informational gaps that all of us have about these environments. I saw something come up in the chat, but I can't see it.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. So it says, with a city with a shifting landscape due to earthquakes like the Seattle area, have you worked with the city to find a way for them to be proactive in fixing uneven sidewalks?
Yes. Yeah. So thank you for that question. So we have talked to the city in various times. One of the concerns of the city, for example, in sharing their quality of sidewalks data has been liability concerns. As you may or may not know, Seattle was sued several years ago, and part of the settlement was actually to do a really detailed inventory of the quality of sidewalks. One of the hurdles is then finding the resources to actually make the corrections for some of these. The inventory itself took place in 2017. The data became available online. It's open data. You can use it in 2018. And what it showed is 145,000 issues over Seattle sidewalks. One of the sad parts about this collection is that they really didn't do a very good job in standardizing non-subjective kinds of detailed data like I was talking about, right? So instead of trying to classify that information to make it interpretable to users, they used somewhat esoteric terms, a lot of which were overlapping. And so what ended up being the case when we looked at these 145,000 data elements was it was unfortunately biased to the intern who was doing the collection. So, you know, one intern really liked to annotate like pretty much any problem on the sidewalk as a gap, whereas another intern might have really liked to call that an uprise. And both of those are somewhat overlapping. Like you can look at one issue and sort of classify it as one or the other because the definitions they provided for that data collection were not, one, super objective, and two, there was a lot of overlap there. So these are the kinds of concerns that we raise when we do these data specification definitions. We really try to understand how will data producers actually be able to use these data standards in ways that make that information usable downstream. Now, Seattle is now sort of trying to grapple with like what to do with this. I think on the whole, they've now just decided to classify all 145,000 issues into like minor versus major. And then there's a whole process that they go through in terms of funding some of the resources to ameliorate some of these concerns. There are a lot of equity considerations that go into place in a city planning effort. There are also a lot of funding considerations. So what they try to do is to combine funding sources from different places. So like the schools will get some kind of funding to improve infrastructure, and then the city will have some additional money from another fund, and they'll try to combine those together in order to fund the most beneficial outcomes. Again, one of the problems is they can't really tell what's the most beneficial because we have really poor data on pedestrian counts, and we have really poor data on like what are the bottlenecks associated with the different environments. So one tool that we've offered them, but I don't think they've used is, you know, once we have this kind of detailed data, we're able to ask a question of like, how disconnected is the city? So what you see in this pretty dense map is that the majority of the sidewalks in Seattle belong to one of two gray layers of connected sidewalk environments. But then there are like 100 or so other disconnected islands. We call these accessibility islands that offer the city information about, okay, if you are a traveler and require curb ramps, then this purple region is completely disconnected from the rest of the city. And in order to ameliorate that, you need to install some curb ramps that will connect this purple region with this cyan region, for example. So these kinds of analytics, again, are only available when you have this kind of detailed sidewalk infrastructure information, but not if you know, all you know is that what the city currently knows, which is, yes, there is a sidewalk on the east side of 15th Avenue, and it was last visited in 1980, and we gave them a permit to do, you know, to create a driveway in 1985. This is kind of the format in which currently municipalities are containing this kind of asset information. I gave a very long answer to a pretty simple question. I hope that was sufficient.
That was wonderful. One more question. Is your team well supported at this time to include sensory considerations into planned machine learning programming and in the transient real-time aspect?
Thank you. Right. So transience is hard. We do things like, as you saw, we join timetables, for example. We're also able to join weather considerations. So as an example, we do look at the kinds of paved surfaces and how that would be impacted by rain or snow. We also have information on crowdedness, and that does come into play with sensory considerations. So time of day joined with, you know, how crowded the sidewalk typically is would provide us with some information that we can give people, you know, in terms of avoiding crowded sidewalks. Noise levels are another thing that we are currently using ubiquitous sensors in the city, but that is a piece of infrastructure that we don't place. So we use whatever ubiquitous sensing the city already does. The problem with that is that a place like Seattle only has like 500 interspaced nodes that collect this kind of information. So we don't quite get the level of detail that we like to have from, you know, that would give us noise levels pretty much on every single sidewalk. So we don't have the resolution that we want, but we do use that kind of information. Now, we use other surrogates that will give us similar information. For example, because of our car-centric world, we do have a lot of information on throughput of streets. So one of the ways that cities do metricize their streets is like how many cars move through here per day. We don't count how many pedestrians, but we do know how many cars pass through there. And that gives us some notion of like the noise levels that you might incur when using these pedestrian infrastructure, but it's not ideal. We use them as surrogates because we know that that's all the data we can get our hands on right now.
Another question, could the Find It and Fix It pothole program be retrofitted for fixing sidewalks and other mobility challenged areas?
So my knowledge of the Find It, Fix It app is really just as a way of notifying the city that there is a concern. I'm not really sure how the questioner is asking about retrofitting it. I think the way things are currently done is that those requests get funneled into the municipality, and then, you know, they kind of sit in a database until they're ready to, you know, do the 13 curb ramps that they have money to do that year. And then they look basically for those locations that received the largest number of requests. But that's my knowledge of how that data gets funneled. I don't know that it's, I mean, one of the problems is that those are some of the only mechanisms for citizens to inform the city about issues, but it's not really a great structure for doing so, because in some ways, you know, people need to know about this app. We already know that there's a pretty biased demographic of people that contribute to these concerns and others don't. So I think the city or cities in general are trying to understand how to better engage communities in contributing that kind of information in more equitable ways.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Caspi. I'm going to invite Mike Stewart back with us.
Great.
We have just a little closing.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really wonderful to be here.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Caspi, for just your incredible and important work and leadership in our community. We cannot thank you for your time. On behalf of the board, staff, and the families we serve, thank you so much. And I just want to again share with everybody that was able to attend today. We appreciate your time. And once again, just recognize our presenting sponsor, West Monroe Partners. We really appreciate your support to make events like this happen. And again, to be able to amplify the incredible work of Dr. Caspi. So with that, I want to let everyone back to their Fridays, but thank you again. We will certainly continue this wonderful type, and hopefully we can do this in person sooner than later. So thank you so much and have a wonderful Friday.